There was no need for Peggy to prepare Miranda. She knew from the first instant that she held her baby in her arms. She had slept in exhaustion for 12 hours, and then the wet nurse came into her bearing a tiny bundle.
"I nicht can make him to suck, gnädige Frau,"
the woman said sadly, and laid the bundle beside Miranda, who raised herself on her elbow and parted the blankets. She gazed down for a long time. Then her head dropped back on the pillow. She shut her eyes. "Go away, please," she said to the nurse. When Peggy stole in later, she found them like that. Miranda with her eyes closed and slow tears sliding down into the baby's fuzzy hair where his head nestled against his mother's cheek. "Oh, darling, don't," cried Peggy, and knelt beside the bed. "Sure, he'll be happier in heaven, the precious lambkin. 'Tis the Blessed Mother herself will keep him safe for you till you come." Miranda stirred and opened her eyes. "He must be baptized at once. Get Dominie Heisman," she said faintly. It was over this matter of the hurried christening that Miranda first discovered Nicholas's refusal to admit that anything was wrong with his son. It was only after she shattered herself with anguished tears that he consented to let the Dominie go through the form as a foolish concession. Later, in a month or two, it would be done properly in church with a traditional ceremony and all the countryside as witnesses, Nicholas stated, and Miranda said nothing. Her heavy heart was lightened a little when the baby had been duly named Adrian Peter Van Ryn, and the horrified pastor had scurried back to his wife, who soon spread the sad news far and wide along the river. The baby lived for 6 days, and during that time, and despite Nicholas's angry protests, Miranda kept her son with her, allowing no one else to touch him but Peggy. She refused to admit the wet nurse, and it was from her own breasts that he drew a tiny amount of nourishment. But he had not the strength to suckle properly, and on a stormy Friday night he gave a little cry and ceased finding the strength to breathe. While those 6 sad and dragging days passed, Miranda had thought much of God. She sent Peggy to fetch the Bible her father had given her. It had lain for months in the bottom of a drawer, but now she placed it beneath her pillow and read constantly. What had for years been jumbles of meaningless words resolved themselves now, in the light of her sorrow, into comfort and strength. She held the baby close to her and whispered the 61st Psalm for herself and him. "Hear my cry, O God. Attend unto my prayer. From the end of the earth will I cry unto thee, when my heart is overwhelmed. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I." And gradually some measure of resignation came to her. For Nicholas there was none. When he walked into the room on that Friday night and saw Miranda's face, he gave a violent exclamation. She shook her head, looking at him sorrowfully. "Hush," she whispered. "God has taken him, Nicholas dear." He flung back the coverlet, staring at the small, still figure. His face was convulsed. He wheeled on Peggy, who crouched by the bedpost, weeping quietly. "It's you who've done this, you loathsome cripple!" he shouted, advancing on her. "You've handled him roughly, you've let him fall." "Mother of God!" Peggy whispered, shrinking. Her hands flew to her throat. She backed inch by inch from that blazing, murderous face. "Nicholas!" Miranda screamed, trying to rise from the bed. For a moment he hesitated, and Peggy drew a rasping, terrified breath. Then the fury drained from his face, leaving it grey, and he strode out of the room. For 3 days he did not reappear. He locked himself in the tower room, which had been long unused. Frantic at her helplessness, for she was still too weak to get up, Miranda sent repeated messages and pleas by the butler and Mrs. McNabb. She didn't dare send Peggy. To these messages he answered through the locked door that she might make whatever arrangements she liked, nor would he say more. The tiny white coffin travelled to the churchyard accompanied only by the wailing servants and Peggy, who had forcibly prevented her mistress from going. On the morning after the funeral, Nicholas came downstairs. He entered Miranda's room and greeted her with a brief kiss. "Good morning, my love. You look very well. White always suits you." She stared up at him, stupefied. Her eyes turned blankly to her white bed jacket, then back to his face. It was thin and drawn, and had a sallow tinge which it had never had before. His suit was rumpled, as was his cravat, and about him there was a very faint, sweetish odor. "Nicholas," she cried, "I've been so terribly worried about you." "That was foolish," he answered, and he smiled. Behind the smile there was a warning. He walked to the window and parted the curtains. "The ice must be 3 feet deep in the West Channel, and deep enough by our pier. We must give a skating party. I'll make out a list at once." "Party?" she repeated. "Oh, I don't understand you." She turned her face from him. She had been sure that when the first violence of his grief had passed, then they would comfort each other, be drawn together closer than they had ever been by their mutual sorrow. And now, as Nicholas continued to talk lightly of invitations, of the state of the roads, and the possibility of more snow, she saw with anguish how it was to be. During the remainder of their life together, he never referred to the baby, nor seemed to hear on the few occasions when anyone else did. It was as though it had never been. Chapter 18. The River families were mollified by the Van Ryns' tragedy. One brisk March day, the widow Mary Livingston arrayed herself in the most imposing of her fluted white caps, and having passed the night visiting a friend in Valatie, she drove over to Dragonwyck. After that visit, she told everyone that Mrs. Van Ryn was a sweet little thing and had grown most ladylike. "I don't blame Nicholas in the least for marrying her," the widow told Mrs. Robert Livingston of Linlithgow, who had come to the hill for tea. "And for my part, I think he's lucky. From a child he's always been difficult, you know. I remember how his poor mother, Katrina Brinkerhoff she was, from Rhinebeck, used to worry about him. He'd have gloomy fits, wouldn't speak to anyone, and pig-headed. She was the only one who could manage him. He'd never listened to his father." She paused to replenish her visitor's cup, and added reflectively, "She was a pretty creature, Katrina was. Don't know as I ever saw such masses of lovely golden hair on anyone. Come to think of it, this new wife of Nicholas's is something the same type." "Is she?" said the other lady politely, helping herself to a seed cake. "I wonder," said the widow Mary, pursuing her own line of thought, "if Johanna was ever really happy with Nicholas." "Oh, but surely," cried Mrs. Robert, "she was mad about him, and he was always so devoted." The widow inclined her stately head. "I know, but Johanna told me once long ago, before she got so corpulent and—" Mindful that she was speaking of the dead, she suppressed stupid and substituted slow. "She told me that he'd never forgive her for not bearing him a son. Those were her very words. He'll never forgive me. Of course, she couldn't have another try at it, you know." The widow leaned forward and whispered. The old lady had flourished in a franker age and was sometimes indelicately outspoken. Mrs. Robert Livingston blushed. "Oh, well," she said hastily, "a disappointment, of course, but it happens to many." "That's what I told Johanna, but she just sat and stared at me with those pale round eyes of hers." "You don't know, Nicholas," she said. The way she said it gave me quite a turn. "Indeed," said Mrs. Robert, growing bored, for she had never known the Van Ryns very well. "No doubt he'll have a healthy son yet. And if you think the new wife is acceptable, I too will call when I'm in the neighborhood." She did call, and the rest of the local gentry followed suit. The young Van Ryns entertained constantly that year. Nicholas seemed possessed of feverish energy. Gone were the quiet domestic days they had enjoyed before the baby came. He invited people for weeks at a time, all kinds of people, New York or Albany aristocracy, English noblemen. There was always in New York at that period a stray foreigner or two with a portfolio of notes entitled "My Observations of American Life." He invited soldiers, too, though no one below the rank of captain. In September, Mexico surrendered, and the eastern states were crammed with returning victorious heroes. Dragonwyck hummed with voices from the time that guests straggled down to the huge buffet breakfasts until after midnight, when they straggled up again, exhausted with festivities. Miranda had no time to consult her soul and no privacy. Outside of her room there were people, and within it there was always Nicholas. She had no friends. Several times one amongst the hordes of guests had attracted her, and she had thought that here at last was someone who saw her as an individuality apart from Nicholas, but the situation never ripened. Without ever seeming to do so, Nicholas intervened, and soon the guest would depart again, having seen in Miranda only a pretty young wife who adored her husband and had nothing much to say for herself. In the same way, the visit from Miranda's mother was repeatedly postponed. Abigail could have come now at any time. Her rheumatism had improved. Tabitha's baby was doing well. When Abigail had received the letter telling of the death of Miranda's own baby, she had expected to leave for Dragonwyck at once. But the months went by, and there was no more talk of her coming. Miranda's letters became very infrequent and brief. They read like society bulletins. "Yesterday we entertained ex-President Van Buren and a host of others who have interest in the election." Or, "Tomorrow we go to a ball at the Astors. I believe it is to be a brilliant affair." Nothing personal in them. Abigail hid her hurt under brusqueness of manner. Ephraim, the boys, and even little Charity suffered under the increased sharpness of her tongue. And as for Jeff, until the autumn of 1849, Miranda did not see him at all. She had thought for a while after the baby's death that she would see him often, that Nicholas, who must like the young doctor, for had he not called him in a crisis, would invite Jeff to Dragonwyck. Nicholas not only would not invite Jeff, but he forbade Miranda to see him for any reason. She might not take Peggy to have the leg looked at. She was to have nothing more to do with Dr. Turner. Miranda had long since ceased trying to find reasons for all her husband's behavior, but she understood that he wished to see nothing and no one who reminded him of the baby's death. And she submitted in this too, all the more readily because she had a feeling of guilt about Jeff. Her interest in him and her tenderness and gratitude were not entirely fitting to a wife. So she did as Nicholas wished. It was in New York on May 10th of 1849 that this phase of Miranda's life came to an abrupt close, and the Astor Place massacre was the cause of it. The Van Ryns were bidden by the Clement Vandergraves to dine at 4 and go on afterward to the Astor Place Opera House, where they would witness William Charles Macready's interpretation of Macbeth. All of fashionable New York was going, not only because performances at the Opera House were extremely elegant — it had been built in 1847 by 150 gentlemen of wealth and social prominence — but because Macready's appearance tonight promised to be interesting. 3 days ago, on May 7th, the ridiculous feud between the English Macready and the American Edwin Forrest had reached a minor climax, when both actors presented themselves in Macbeth on the same evening, Macready at the Astor and Forrest at the Broadway. There had been disturbance at both performances. Each audience was composed of friends who cheered and enemies who groaned and catcalled. Society, on the whole, was amused. Everyone knew and discussed the rivals' relative rights to be incensed with each other. Aside from the loss of dignity and lack of ordinary courtesy displayed by two talented actors, this spectacle would have affected nobody except that it got out of bounds and was seized upon by the malcontents of the city. The quarrel became a symbol of class war. Macready was an Englishman and the favorite of New York society. Forrest was favored by the populace, not only because he was an American, but because he was most persuasive in such roles as Jack Cade and Spartacus, which personified the struggle of the underdog against entrenched privilege. Nicholas and Miranda, in a barouche, set out from Stuyvesant Street at 4 o'clock, on their way to the Vandergraves in Gramercy Square. Miranda was happy. The May afternoon was fresh and fragrant. Nicholas was in a good humor, and there was the prospect of the theater with congenial companions. Miranda liked the Vandergraves, and she adored the theater second only to opera, which had been for her an enchanted discovery. She was conscious of looking her best tonight. Both she and Nicholas were in the ultra-formal attire which was expected, not only from subscribers to the boxes, but from each member of the Astor Place Opera House audience. It was this emphasis upon full dress which particularly infuriated those of the populace who dared aspire to seeing the best opera or drama in the city. Without a black frock coat, white vest, and white kid gloves, no gentleman would be admitted. To brighten the severity of his garb, Nicholas wore a very small carnation in his buttonhole and a set of sapphire studs. Miranda looked at him admiringly. Whatever the inner disquiet in their relationship, or perhaps because of that disquiet, she had never come to take her husband for granted. She still saw him consciously, not with the blank eye of habit, but alertly. The firm chiseling of his dark profile above the frilled white stock, the blackness of his hair, and the always startling blueness of his eyes beneath their heavy brows, these things still had power to make her heart beat faster. "Do you like my new dress, Nicholas?" she asked, hungry for the appreciation which he often withheld. But today he was generous. He turned and surveyed her, smiling. Her dress was of midnight blue, that color of all others most flattering to blondes, and the low, heart-shaped bodice was cut as a basque. Of this Miranda was proud. It was a new fashion direct from Paris, and would not be adopted in New York for another year. She had daringly avoided all the frills and flounces which were considered essential, and used for ornament only a diamond bow knot at her breast, and a diamond arrow and tiny blue feather in her high-puffed hair. Nicholas raised her white-gloved hand to his lips. "You're beautiful, my love. You have excellent taste in dress. It's always pleased me." "Do I please you in all ways, Nicholas?" she asked wistfully. It was so seldom that he praised her, so seldom that he was approachable like this. He was silent for a minute, and she thought instantly, what a fool I was to ask that. Neither of them had ever mentioned it, but she knew what he was thinking. She had not yet given him another son. She had gone secretly to consult Dr. Francis on this delicate point, and had been reassured. There was nothing wrong whatsoever. It was just a matter of time. Nature was unpredictable. "You wouldn't be sitting here with me in my carriage if you didn't," said Nicholas, and he laughed. Decidedly, he was in a very good mood tonight. The carriage stopped on the west side of Gramercy Park, before a flight of steps, which led to a white-trimmed doorway bright with gleaming brass. The Vandergraves were as trim and shining as their house, and as solid. They were both round and rosy and kind. As do many happily married couples, they had grown to look alike, and Rebecca's smiling face between two glossy wings of neat brown hair resembled her husband's smiling face between equally neat and glossy side whiskers. Upstairs in the attic nurseries there romped 8 little Vandergraves, all topped with neat brown hair, and all as round and rosy as their parents. At 6:30, when it was time to leave for the opera house, whose performances began at 7 sharp, Miranda was sorry to go. Neither the lengthy meal nor the conversation had been brilliant, but she had enjoyed herself. Rebecca's good-humored chatter, her assumption that everyone was as good and happy as she was, created an atmosphere of ease. They all went together in the Vandergrave carriage, and when they reached 14th Street, Rebecca, who had been speaking with tolerant amusement of Commodore Vanderbilt's efforts to bludgeon his way into social acceptance, suddenly checked herself and cast an uneasy look at the street. "Oh, dear," she said, "there seem to be a great many rough-looking men about, and they give us such horrid stares. You don't think there will be any trouble tonight, do you, Mr. Vandergrave?" Her husband patted her hand. "Of course not, my pet." At that moment the carriage paused to make way for the crosstown stage, and a large poster intruded itself on the startled gaze of the carriage's 4 occupants. In fiery red letters the poster exhorted, "Americans, arouse! The great crisis has come. Decide now whether English aristocrats shall triumph in this, America's metropolis. Working men, free men, come out. Dare to own yourselves son of the iron hearts of 76. "Oh, dear," cried Rebecca again with increased alarm. "What are they planning? Don't you think we should turn back?" "Why, no, madam," said Nicholas in genuine amusement. "You would surely not let a few hysterical rowdies spoil your evening's pleasure. This silly actors' quarrel has nothing to do with us." The ladies looked relieved. Clement Vandergrave cleared his throat and swallowed the order he had been about to give the coachman. But a sullen mob filled Astor Place. While carriage after carriage rolled through to discharge its occupants on the red carpet that stretched up the granite steps to the palisaded portico, this mob gave way just enough for the vehicles to pass, but a low growl like distant thunder hovered in the still twilight air. As the Vandergrave party entered the theatre, a man in a brown suit pushed past them and brandished his arms at the queue which formed before the ticket office. "You can't get in there, you poor fools," he yelled, waving a bit of pasteboard. "I paid for this ticket, and they wouldn't let me in because I hadn't kid gloves and a white vest on. They shut the door in my face. Damn the stinking nabobs." The thundering growl outside rose higher in pitch, muffled but distinct through the opera house walls. Miranda looked up at Nicholas. "It does seem more than just an actor's quarrel, doesn't it?" she asked hesitantly. "I mean, it seems to be directed against people like us." "I dare say," answered Nicholas, ushering her into their box and settling himself on one of the red velvet seats. "The lower classes are always jealous and trying to ape their betters." There was a distant crash and the diminishing tinkle of glass. A murmur of consternation ran over the audience. All eyes turned for reassurance to the group of frock-coated policemen who stood together in a far corner under the balcony. Their chief, Mr. Matzel, chewed on his fingernails and looked unconcerned. The audience settled back again and consulted their programs. The curtain rose on time, and the 3 weird sisters played to a quiet, waiting house. When Macready, tastefully arrayed in chain mail, strode on in the 3rd scene and announced to Banquo, "So foul and fair a day I have not seen," he was greeted with an ovation, marred by a few hisses which the police suppressed, and supporters rushed a placard to the side of the proscenium, which stated that the Friends of Order will remain quiet. The Friends of Order did remain quiet, but the mob outside did not. It worked itself into a fury. In the 7th scene, just as Macready, beating his breast and flashing his eyes, began, "I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition," a handful of stones crashed through the upper windows and bounced harmlessly along the gallery. Then clearly through those broken windows the frightened audience heard a shout, "Tear it down! Burn the damned den of the aristocracy!" Macready paused only a second, and then went on at breakneck speed to Miss Pope, who made a valiant, if pale and trembling, Lady Macbeth. Another clatter of stones fell into the theatre. One of them hit the gorgeous chandelier, which shivered and tinkled threateningly. The parquet audience rushed back under the galleries. The play went on through the uproar, though the actors became inaudible and were reduced to the status of wildly gesticulating puppets. Mr. Vandegrave rose. "I'm going to take my wife home," he said to Nicholas in a low voice, "and I presume you will do the same. This is outrageous." "Why, no," answered Nicholas, smiling and rising to help Rebecca with her shawl. "I believe we'll stay. I'm fond of Macbeth, and find this particular interpretation remarkably interesting." He indicated the stage, where the third act was in resolute progress, though the actors had to skip over a stream of water which gushed from pipes which had been broken in Mr. Macready's dressing-room. Vandegrave shook his head and presented his arm to his wife. They quitted the box and hurried with other prudent ones toward the 8th Street exit, where a squad of policemen escorted them outside. "Don't you think we should go too?" asked Miranda nervously. There was a constant banging of bricks, paving stones, and pebbles against the facade of the building. The balconies shouted and stamped to the accompaniment of the pandemonium outside on Astor Place. "Are you afraid?" asked Nicholas, laughing. She saw that he was exhilarated. He, who was so seldom amused by anything, derived from the hostility which surrounded them, from the mouthing, frightened players, the shrieking audience, a sardonic delight. A sharp apprehension seized her, fear that was separate from the contagion of panic around her. Toward the close of the last act, there was a lull outside, occasioned, though no one in the theatre knew it, by the arrival of the militia in Astor Place, 60 cavalry and 300 infantry. The last scenes became audible. The final curtain came down, and Macready appeared bowing and was received with cheers. The manager made a hurried announcement, thanking those who had stayed and asking the audience to leave through the back door, where the constabulary would ensure their safety. Everyone obediently surged toward the indicated exit. Everyone but Nicholas. He adjusted Miranda's satin pelisse for her, put on his black cape, and blew some specks of dust from his gloves. Then he placed his tall hat under his arm. "Where are we going?" cried Miranda, as he ushered her from the box and turned down the deserted corridor to the right. "Out the front entrance, as we came in, of course." She drew back, hanging on his arm. "But that's where the disturbance is. Oh, please, please, Nicholas, go with the others. I implore you." "The disturbance seems to have died down," he said with the faintest tinge of regret. "But in any case, would you really contemplate our scuttling through the back door like mice?" "Yes," she thought passionately. "I want to get home. I want to be safe." But she was silenced by her habit of obedience and the instinctive admiration for physical courage. The great front doors were barricaded from the inside. Nicholas removed the planks and held one of the doors for her to pass through. At once they saw the reason for the silence. The troops were ranged along the base of the steps confronting the mob. Both factions were uncertain, eyeing each other warily. Now and again one of the rioters shied an isolated stick, stone, or rotten apple at the soldiers, who dodged as best they could and endured stoically. They had no orders to fire. The flickering light of torches, and such of the street lamps as had not been broken, illuminated the square. On the Bowery corner, a fountain of water from a smashed hydrant gushed high in the air. In the darkness of the colonnade around the theatre, no one had noticed Miranda and Nicholas. They might still have slipped down behind the troops, and, mingling with the Lafayette Street crowd, who were mostly onlookers and curiosity-seekers, have walked the 2 blocks home. The mob had exhausted its venom, and nearly exhausted its missiles, too. It was nearing midnight, and in the absence of any victims and confronted by the impassive militia, most of the rioters began to think of drifting away. They had made their demonstration against foreign rule and the aristocracy. They had inflicted a certain amount of damage on the hated opera house. Perhaps that was enough. The frenzy for destruction ebbed with every passing moment. A good many of the older men were beginning to tell themselves it was a good thing there'd been no bloodshed. Then Nicholas walked down the steps, and pushing through the astonished soldiers, appeared in the front rank and gazed at the mob. For a dumbfounded instant they were hushed, and then 100 cries rose. "Bloody bastard snob! Spoil his pretty clothes for him! Give it to him!" But still there was no concerted action. They seethed back and forth, fists were brandished, a few futile pebbles thrown, when suddenly a boy darted up carrying a bucket. He had filled it at the hydrant, and laughing in an excited voice, "This'll spoil his fancy duds!" he flung the water full over Nicholas. There were cheers and approving roars. The crowd was willing now to be satisfied with horseplay rather than violence. The spectacle of a dripping aristocrat delighted them. Nicholas' arm shot out in one quick, smooth motion. He seized the rifle of the soldier beside him, aimed carefully, and fired. The boy dropped the bucket. The taunting laugh on his face crumpled into a look of foolish amazement. From the hole in his throat spurted a jet of blood, black as ink in the dim light. Before he fell to the cobblestones, 50 shots spattered across the square. The militia had started firing. The mob, frantic now with terror, sent one last volley of paving stones before they fled. One of these stones hit Nicholas on the chest. He fell to the sidewalk, not 10 feet from the dying boy. 2 of the soldiers carried Nicholas back to the colonnade and laid him on the top step. Miranda knelt beside him, chafing his hands, easing his head on her wadded-up pelisse. The horror of the last few minutes receded. She no longer heard the screams and shots from the square. Her brain worked clearly. She knew exactly what to do. She saw that Nicholas, though unconscious, did not seem seriously injured, but he must be taken home at once. "Go to the Van Ryn house on Stuyvesant Street," she ordered one of the soldiers. "Tell whoever opens the door that I want the carriage to hurry to the 8th Street entrance of the Opera House. There must be 3 of our men, blankets and brandy. Then you will wait and show them where we are." Before the soldier came back to them, accompanied by McNabb, a footman, and the coachman, the riot in Astor Place had ended. Amongst 50 who were wounded, there were 20 corpses on the cobblestones. These included 2 bystanders, a little girl who had stolen from her house in Lafayette Street to see why the soldiers were shooting, and an old man who was on his way home to Jones Street after visiting his daughter uptown. The troops marched back to their barracks. To the north, Grace Church's new marble spire shone like an inverted icicle against the midnight sky. Chapter 19. A month later, when the Van Ryns moved up to Dragonwyck, Nicholas had entirely recovered from the effects of the blow from the paving stone, which had cracked 2 ribs but done no other physical damage. His body had recovered, but his personality had changed. He wished to see no one. As abruptly as the phase of activity and continual hospitality had started, it now stopped. During his convalescence in New York, he lay day after day, moody and silent, accepting Miranda's or Mrs. McNabb's nursing without comment. Nobody knew of his part in the Astor Place massacre. If any of his friends had heard the story, most of them would have considered that his action had been justified. They would have applauded his courage. What was the life of one vicious hoodlum amongst so many dead and wounded? And after all, the militia had fired at the same time. The conviction grew upon Miranda that Nicholas was suffering and that he felt remorse. This enabled her to bear his gloomy moroseness. In nightmares she repeatedly saw the blood spurting from the jagged hole in a thin boyish throat, and she thought that Nicholas saw it too. That was not what Nicholas saw. He saw a man whose invincibility had been scathed by a chance blow, a man who had been unconscious and impotent for the first time in his life, a man who had to depend on strangers for safety, strangers and Miranda. They returned to Dragonwyck, and his moroseness and his silence continued. One day he mounted the tower stairs and locked himself into the room at the summit. He did not reappear for 3 days, and Miranda, remembering how it had been after the baby's death, left him alone. When he came back to her, he seemed more normal than he had since his injury. But upon his first greeting her, she noticed the same faint, sweet odor about his clothes, and his speech was slow, the words almost imperceptibly slurred. Peggy noticed this too. Were it anyone else but the master, she thought, I'd say he'd been on a tout up there a-skulking by himself for 3 livelong days. But he's not got the smell of liquor about him, and he's not the kind of a man for a free and honest swig, not that one, he isn't. A month later, it happened again. Miranda wandered about the house, which, now that it was no longer filled with guests, had for her regained all its oppressive atmosphere. She avoided the servants' eyes, and pretended even to Peggy that Nicholas's conduct was in no way peculiar. Toward twilight of the second day, she made up her mind. She mounted the tower stairs, 50 feet of slow spiraling. The door at the summit was a 6-inch slab of panelled oak. There was no answer to her first knock. She retreated a step and gazed at that dark, implacable door. A year, even a month ago, she would have accepted this silent symbol of Nicholas's orders, would have obeyed him as always. Now she did not. She clenched her fists and pounded on the door until a muffled voice cried angrily, "Who's there?" "It's Miranda," she called back resolutely. "I demand that you let me in." There was silence. Then the key turned in the massive lock, and the door swung open. Nicholas, in a brocaded dressing gown, stood and looked at her sardonically. "Come in, sweetheart. By all means, since you demand it." He closed and locked the door behind her, putting the key in his pocket. She stared blankly at him and at the circular room. What had she expected? A Bluebeard's chamber, a sable-hung and gloomy magnificence, exaggeration of the apartments downstairs? On the contrary, the room was austere and nearly bare, furnished only with a plain table, chair, and couch. On the table were a row of shabby books and an unlit candle. On the floor, a straw matting. Even though the sun had set across the river behind the Catskills, the 4 windows, each facing toward a different compass point, still caught ample light. It was only after a moment that she noticed in the room a bluish haze and a pungent odor. "You smoke here?" she asked vaguely, conscious of a baffled disappointment. She had for so long romanticized this locked room, had been so sure that once she penetrated its secret, she would at the same time penetrate the wall that guarded her husband's soul. He stared at her steadily, so that she turned and answered his gaze, noting with surprise that in his eyes the pupils had shrunk to pinpoints. The irises appeared to be a solid blue. "I smoke here," he repeated her puzzled question with a sarcastic inflection. He reached out and seized her right wrist. His fingers closed around it in a brutal grip. He pulled her over to the couch, and she saw then that on its far side, hitherto hidden, there stood a small charcoal brazier and a taboret on which lay a carved silver box, some fine wires, and 3 strangely shaped pipes. "Behold the diamond gateway to all beauty and all power," he said in that curiously slow voice. She stared at the little pipes and the glowing charcoal. "What is it, Nicholas?" He released her wrist, and opening the silver box, brought out a sticky black ball, which he cupped in his hand. "Opium, my love, the glorious fruit of the poppy." She looked from the sticky ball in his hand to his face. "But that's a drug, isn't it?" she said uncertainly. She had never heard the word except once 2 years ago, when she had skimmed through a newspaper editorial on the evils of the Chinese opium traffic. Nicholas inserted one of the wires into the ball, and twisting off a tiny bead, began to toast it over the brazier. "No drug for me," he said, and his voice sank to a whisper. "No drug, but a javelin to pierce the mist which separates us from reality. It is my servant. All things are my servants, for I am master of life and death. Don't you know that yet, Miranda?" He turned his head and smiled through half-closed lids. Her heart began a slow pounding, but she managed to speak with calm. "You're not well, Nicholas. I know that whatever this stuff is, it's bad for you. Come downstairs with me now, please." He laughed lazily, and placing the cooked pellet in the bowl of one of the pipes, he inhaled deeply, at the same time stretching himself upon the couch. She began to edge cautiously away, and his hand shot out, fastening itself again on her wrist. "Nicholas," she said, looking down at him, "I don't understand. What makes you do this?" It had been on the visit to Poe's cottage that it had first occurred to him to try this instrument of power. Some time after that he had gone down to a shuttered house on Mott Street. That experience had been distasteful. The poppy had not yet yielded to his mastery. He had not sought her again for a long time. There had been a reluctance. How shameful it now seemed. He lay and contemplated that reluctance until it took form, and he saw it as a small, creeping animal which must be crushed. Everything must be crushed which might obscure the flaming brilliance. He turned his head and looked up at Miranda. She, too, had taken on a luminous, fluid quality. In the dimming room her golden head was the only bright spot. His fingers tightened on her wrist until he could feel the small sinews move. "Let me go," she whispered. "You hurt me." He saw that she trembled, and that her long, beautiful lids were lowered to hide the fear behind them. "Let me go!" she cried more loudly. "Ah, but you don't want to go, my darling. Your soul and body are only a reflection of my will." And he twisted her arm until she was forced down beside him on the couch. Her cries were stifled beneath his mouth. She shrank to a frozen stillness. The smell of the opium nauseated her. At last his grip slackened. He pushed her from the couch and reached for the silver box. "Leave me alone," he said dully. "You weary me." He drew the key from his pocket and tossed it on the floor. She bent to pick it up and gave an involuntary moan as pain shot through her swollen wrist. Nicholas lay without moving, his eyes shut. She unlocked the door and, shutting it behind her, walked slowly down the stairs to her bedroom. Peggy, at her eternal task of putting away freshly laundered lingerie, uttered a sharp cry when she saw her mistress. "Whatever is it, Mum?" She gazed, horrified. The Miss's hair was falling down her shoulders and all tangled. Her pretty rose bodice was torn. Worse than that were the great staring eyes of her and the trembling of her pretty mouth. "Oh, and you've hurt yourself, poor darling," cried Peggy, touching the discoloured wrist. "Did he do that, the varmint?" she cried in sudden enlightenment. "'Tis the drink after all, then, he's a-closeted himself with up there." Miranda shook her head. "It's not drink." She moved restlessly to the dressing table, picked up her brush, put it down again. "Peggy, I want to see Dr. Turner. Heaven grant that he's still in Hudson." "He is that, Mum. 'Twas only yesterday they was a-talking in the kitchen about him, and the fine cures he does." "'Twould be for your wrist you were thinking of him?" Miranda looked at her arm. Yes, of course. It should be bound. I don't dare go to Hudson. I must get a message to him somehow. I don't know. "Leave it all to me, Mum," said Peggy with instant comprehension and sympathy. "Write a bit of a note to send to him. I'll see that he gets it by midnight for sure." "But how can you," whispered Miranda, looking up doubtfully, "how can you without danger of—" In this house nothing escaped Nicholas. No orders were given without his approval. Not the most trivial episode took place without his knowledge. Peggy smiled demurely. "There's a lad in the village, Mum. Hans Klockberg, the smith's prentice, wouldn't boggle at doing me a bit of a favour. He's trusty enough for all he's a great hulking duchy." "Peggy, dear, you're not in love?" cried Miranda, momentarily shaken out of her own distress by the little maid's expression. She had come to take this fidelity and affection for granted. It had never occurred to her that Peggy might have a life of her own, might, and this thought filled her with desolation, want to leave and get married. Peggy read her mistress's face, and her own sobered. "I'll never be leaving you whilst you want me, Mrs. dear," she said earnestly. "Never." "But I can't keep her if she has a chance for happiness," thought Miranda passionately. "A chance to get away from this. And I don't know how I'll live without her." She felt that she hated this Hans Klockberg, whoever he was, and at the same time she despised her selfishness. Yet there were only two people in the world of whose love she was certain, Peggy and Abigail. And neither of them had she repaid in kind, for always between herself and them there had stood the shadow of Nicholas. "Come, Mum, write the note," said Peggy with brisk tenderness. "I'm thinking we dare not have the young doctor to the house, for there's no telling when he'll be abroad again, nor yet what he can see from his turret and all. You must meet the doctor outside." She thought swiftly, seeing that the poor dear lady was too deep in misery to plan. "By the old mill on the creek, Mum, as soon as it's light. Ye can slip out. Tell him that in the writing. And Holy Mother of God, keep that one from coming downstairs beforehand," she added to herself. Her prayers were answered. All night long there was no sound from the tower room. Miranda lay alone and sleepless in the great Van Ryn bed. Her sprained wrist throbbed incessantly. At 5 she rose and dressed with Peggy's help. The November morning was chilly. Both women's fingers grew numb and fumbling as they buttoned Miranda into a high-necked blue merino, topped by a hooded grey travelling cape. Everything was arranged, Peggy whispered. Hans had ridden his father's plough horse to Hudson, giving as excuse a sudden pain in the foot which needed doctoring. "Though," said Peggy irrepressibly, "divil a pain or an ache he's had in his life, that one. May the blessed saints forgive him for his untruthfulness. 'Twas artful of him, however, taking it all in all." Miranda smiled sadly at the girl's obvious pride. "Yes, very artful. And then what?" she urged. Jeff had been awakened and read the note. "He looked for a moment as dumbfounded as a hen what's hatched a clutch of ducks," said Peggy, quoting her admirer. "Then he gives a bit of a start and a shake and says he'll be there." Miranda leaned down and kissed Peggy. "Thank you," she whispered. As Peggy stationed herself to wait by the door, Miranda slipped out. She kept close to the protection of the house, then ran 10 yards across the lawn to the nearest hemlocks. From there she hurried shivering through the woods toward the mill creek. Her kid boots made little crunching sounds on the frozen ground. Ahead of her, through the distant oaks and chestnuts, a lurid red sun slid above the horizon. Jeff arrived at the mill first. He tethered his horse and entered the deserted stone building. His life had been full and interesting of late. He had been tremendously excited by the new use of ether as an anesthetic. The famous operation at the Massachusetts General, which publicly introduced it, had taken place while Jeff was still in Mexico, and it was not until the following year that he journeyed to Boston to learn the technique of administering this miracle worker. Since then he had used it enthusiastically, and discovered complete joy in surgery now that one no longer had to inflict agony on the patient. Yes, the past 2 years had been pleasant enough. He had refused either to mourn or pine for Miranda, and by all accounts she had been involved with her husband in a giddy social whirl, so he had put her out of his mind. He had, however, not married Faith, and that young lady, finally vanquished, settled down with a solid young lawyer who seemed to satisfy her very well. Jeff resigned himself to bachelorhood, though resignation was too strong a word for a circumstance to which he seldom gave a thought. And his was no monkish life. On his occasional holidays he could relax as well as the next man, could hugely enjoy a pint of good Barbados rum, and there had been a lusty adventure or two in Boston and New York. When, last night, the brawny young blacksmith had delivered Miranda's note, Jeff had first read it with no reaction but astonished dismay. This summons to a secret rendezvous seemed to him melodramatic and ridiculous. When he reread the note, he saw in the jerky writing and incoherent sentences signs of mental strain bordering on hysteria. He who never refused anyone who needed him could hardly deny Miranda, but he did feel a strong reluctance to subjecting himself again to the upsetting emotions which she invoked. Still, here he was, cold, hungry for his breakfast, and certainly in no romantic mood. He saw her slender grey figure come toward him through the bare tree trunks. Despite her hurry and the tingling of her chilled feet, she moved with her own particular grace. He went to meet her, and she stretched out her left hand to him in a gesture half greeting, half supplication. "Jeff, thank you for coming. I had to see you, talk to someone. It's about Nicholas." "What is it, Miranda? Tell me," he said quietly, seeing that now she was here she scarcely knew what to say. She cast involuntary frightened glances in the direction of the manor house, and the hand which clutched the cape tight around her chest trembled. She moistened her lips. "I don't know why I came," she said distractedly. "There really isn't much to tell. It seems different now." He gave her a keen look. She obviously needed rest and a sedative. As both were impossible, he substituted the only remedy at hand. He unrolled his saddle blanket and spread it over one of the wheat bins. On the stone pavement near her, he hurriedly built a small fire. When the aromatic smoke began to curl toward the rafters, he sat down on the bin beside her. "It feels good," she said gratefully. She spread her hands out to the blaze. "Hello," said Jeff. "What's happened to that wrist?" He noted her quick flush and motion of concealment while he examined the mottled swelling, which now extended from forearm to knuckles. "I doubt that there's anything broken, but it's a nasty wrench. Cold cloth arnica and rest it needs when you get back." He pulled a large cotton handkerchief from his pocket and fashioned it deftly into a sling. "How did it happen, Miranda?" She turned away from him. Here, in this quiet old mill beside the fire, that scene in the tower became unreal, and the shock which had driven her to summon Jeff merged into an aching weariness. His presence brought her comfort and security, at the same time that it seemed to banish her last weeks with Nicholas into the world of distorted fancy. She longed to lean her head against that powerful shoulder in the worn greatcoat, to shut her eyes and rest. But Jeff persisted. He knew very well that it was not for the treatment of her wrist that she had summoned him by means of that frantic little note. He saw that both her nervous condition and her loyalty to Nicholas were now inhibiting her, and her manner convinced him that her injury had been caused by Nicholas. "You've had a disagreement with your husband?" he asked gently. "Tell me, my dear. You asked for my help, and now you must trust me. Think of me as a physician only, and one used to hearing all sorts of strange things. She nodded slowly. I know. She bent forward, gazing into the fire. He's been different lately. I guess he's always been, but ever since the theater riot in May. I don't suppose you heard. He was hurt. But it isn't that. My dear girl, said Jeff patiently, smiling a little, you must begin at the beginning. Is your husband sick? Is it perhaps that he's taken to drinking too much? No, she said with sudden quiet. He smokes opium. Smokes opium? Jeff repeated, so much startled that for a second he wanted to laugh. He might have known that Nicholas's temperament would demand nothing as usual as liquor. It's not serious, then? She asked, watching his face anxiously. He sobered at once. I don't know much about opium, Miranda. A country doctor has no experience of such drugs, nor many city ones either, I guess. But tell me everything, and I hope I can help you. She began, haltingly, hunting for words. She briefly described the shooting at Astor Place and Nicholas's constant gloom and sulkiness afterward. She attributed this gloom to remorse. She told of his sequestrations in the tower room and of her own discovery yesterday. But of the hour which she had spent locked in with Nicholas, she gave no details. It was only from the expression of her lowered eyes that Jeff drew an inkling of what had passed. He rose and busied himself in building up the fire, determined not to let his personal emotions intrude. He had offered his help to her as a physician, and this objective advice she should get. He walked to the glassless window, and staring down at the mill-stream, which purled and rollicked beneath a coating of ice, he shut out all thought of Miranda, and tried to consider Nicholas dispassionately. Had Jeff been born 100 years later, he would have used to himself the cant phraseology of an as yet unrecognized science. But he needed no props beyond his own analytical perception and knowledge of human character to understand that the taking of opium represented to Nicholas, whatever he might choose to call it, escape from intolerable circumstances, and that in different degree his cycles of furious activity and his cycles of withdrawal from life represented the same desire for escape. But what he's trying so hard to get away from, I don't know, thought Jeff, except that whenever his all-conquering ego butts up against something unpleasant he can't change, like the baby's death and the rent laws, he pretends they haven't happened. He turned suddenly and looked at Miranda. Why don't you leave Dragonwyck for a while? Go home and visit, he said brusquely. She raised her head and looked at him with a sad little smile. That's what you always used to say to me, that first year here, remember? Go home, go home. I couldn't then, and... She paused. Her hood had fallen back and the firelight flickered over her bright hair. And I can't now, she finished very low. Why not? He asked angrily. Won't he let you? No, he wouldn't let me, but I don't want to. I couldn't leave him. He needs me. Rot, snapped Jeff. I know enough to know that you can't do anything with a drug addict unless he wants to be cured. You can take away his opium, but he'll get more. He'll degrade you, too. Do you want another wrist like that one, or worse? She slid off the wheat bin and stood up, looking at him coldly. You've always misjudged him, she said. It's because he feels remorse for shooting that boy that he's this way now. I couldn't desert him. He needs help. Underneath, he's really fine and good. Does she really believe that? Thought Jeff, stupefied. You didn't feel that way when you wrote me that note, when you came here this morning, he cried in exasperation. He wanted to shake her. He wanted to kiss her pathetic swollen arm. Yes, I did, she said, lifting her chin stubbornly. To his own dismay, he suddenly leaned over and kissed her hard on the lips. There was a silence. She put her hand to her mouth with a startled gesture. Jeff, she whispered, staring at him. Sorry, he said, But you needn't look quite so flabbergasted. Female intuition can't amount to much if you hadn't some idea of the way I feel about you." She shook her head slowly. "No, I don't think I did." Her first astonishment gave place to a more poignant emotion. She thought of the baby's birth and the strength she had drawn from Jeff. She thought of her talk with Dr. Francis in Poe's kitchen and the unexpected pleasure that had come to her at the mention of Jeff's name. Seeing her troubled frown, he grinned with the humor that never deserted him for long. "Don't let it worry you. I'm not a lovesick young calf, nor am I going to force on you any indecent proposals. I don't, as a matter of fact, know just why my affections should have so inconveniently centered themselves on you." He stopped, considering whether that were true. Part of her attraction for him was physical, of course, the slender body with its lovely grace of movement, the bright hair, the provocative set of her hazel eyes beneath straight brown brows. But other women had had for him as strong a physical appeal. It was her essential innocence and helplessness that had drawn him. That, and, paradoxically enough, her blind concentration on Nicholas. In the beginning, perhaps this had given her the glamour of the unattainable, constituted an unconscious challenge. But now it was more than that. The sweetness of her lips beneath his kiss had focused his love once and for all. And even while he spoke to her half-teasingly, he felt a heavy weight of longing and sadness. "I must go, Jeff," she said quietly, and she gave him an uncertain little smile, at the same time casting a frightened look in the direction of the manor. "And I haven't helped you at all." He frowned, kicking at the fire to dissipate the still glowing embers. "I'll find out all I can about opium. I'll write you." "Oh, no, please. He'd see the letter. It doesn't matter. I'll manage. Probably it won't happen again." Probably it will, thought Jeff. But he could do nothing. He thought that she regretted having summoned him. He had failed her, not only in practical advice, but in that kiss which had changed their relationship. By his impulsive action he had thrown her back on herself again. "Goodbye," she whispered, not looking at him. And she was gone, running through the trees. It never occurred to him that she had longed to throw herself into his arms, and that the frantic pace at which she ran back toward the house, slipping on the thawing ground, was not caused by eagerness to return to her husband, nor yet fear of discovery. It was from Jeff that she ran, and the yearning which he had aroused in her. Upon her mouth she felt Jeff's kiss as though it were a red stain, and this moved her by revulsion to a guilty loyalty to Nicholas. She had need of this loyalty when he came downstairs that afternoon. He walked into her room without knocking, stood looking down at her silently. His eyes narrowed. She sat by the window idly turning the pages of Godey's, since the injured right hand prevented her usual embroidery. She had hidden the sling under a lace shawl. "You look unusually well, my dear. Your cheeks are quite rosy. Is it rouge, perhaps? Or might it be that you've been for a walk in the crisp November air?" She shrank to wariness. Could he possibly have seen her as she crossed the lawn on her way back to the house? "Why, yes," she answered steadily. "I did go for a walk early this morning. I didn't sleep very well. I thought the air would do me good." "That was sensible," he said, and she saw that the subject of her walk had been a chance shot. He had some other purpose in mind. "Just how is your health these days, my love?" He leaned forward, smiling with the exaggerated courtesy that always meant trouble. "It interests me." Hot color spread over her face. His meaning was unmistakable, but she chose to ignore it, seeking refuge in a casual answer. "It's good of you to be concerned, Nicholas, but I believe I'm very well." She rose quickly. "Will you come and have some food now? I'm sure you must need it." His dark skin was tinged with yellow. His face was drawn and haggard. A muscle twitched beneath his eye. He did not move. "It would be a pity if you were barren, wouldn't it?" he said. "It's the opium, the drug," she thought. "He's not well. It's nearly 3 days since he's eaten, and I can see that he's suffering." She pulled herself together and tried to smile, saying as lightly as she could, "That's a matter of the Lord's will, dear, and after all, we have each other. Surely you didn't marry me just for that." In the silence that followed, her last nervous sentence seemed to her to fall into space, from whence it sped back to her consciousness like a gunshot. "You didn't, did you, Nicholas?" she whispered. "You loved me. Me for myself. I know you did. You do. Underneath. Don't look at me like that," she added violently. His unwavering gaze did not alter. "Like what, my love?" he asked softly. "The way you used to look at—" She bit her lips. "Come downstairs, Nicholas. You must eat something." She slipped her left hand through his arm, and the lace shawl fell to the floor, disclosing the sling. He picked up the shawl, placing it carefully around her shoulders again. She saw his eyes flicker as they rested a moment on her wrist. He said nothing, but across his face there passed a fleeting uncertainty. He followed her to the dining room, and bore with her efforts to make him eat and drink, concealing from her and denying to himself the revulsion of his outraged body. They stayed at Dragonwyck that winter. It was Nicholas's wish, but Miranda was quite willing. She had no desire to be reminded of the Astor Place riot. The theatres and gaieties which had once seemed so attractive no longer appealed to her, and the whole of New York was for her overshadowed by the horror of their last weeks there. Nicholas displayed none of his temperamental peculiarities. He was courteous as always, and showed to Miranda a rather remote consideration. He subjected her neither to the cold indifference nor the fierce lusts which she had suffered in the past. And Miranda, profoundly grateful for this, lived determinedly on the surface, convincing herself that now, at last, they were settling into a normal, placid, married life. Chapter 20. It was on Friday, the 24th of May, that Miranda made her discovery. She awakened that morning to an unusual sense of joy and freedom, which she attributed to the lovely spring weather, unwilling to admit that Nicholas's absence from Dragonwyck might be the true cause. During the last week, the dark, restless mood had come back on him again, and 2 days ago he had suddenly announced that he was going to make a short business trip to New York. He had not invited her to go with him. She had grown so used to his constant company that for the first few hours of his absence she felt blank and at a loss. But this sensation soon gave way to delicious ease and a holiday spirit. It was delightful to occupy the big bed alone, to eat when one wanted to walk or read or shut oneself into the bathroom and soak for hours in the great silver tub. On this morning of the 24th, she awoke filled with energy and a desire to do something amusing. When Peggy came in with the morning tea, she found her mistress sitting up in bed, looking very young and gay. "Good morning, Peggy," she called blithely. "Isn't it a glorious day? I can smell it. Buds and nice fresh sunshine." "It is that, Mum, and you to be looking like a May morning yourself." The little maid helped Miranda into a rose mousseline bed jacket, thinking, "Glory be that things had been better of late. The master had none of his real wicked fits, and mostly been acting as pleasant and as proper as ever did Squire O'Brien at home. And now with him away, 'twas better yet." "And how's your Hans, Peggy?" asked Miranda, smiling mischievously and wishing well to all the world. Would you like the evening off to see him?" Peggy giggled and tossed her head. "I see enough of him as it is. The great lout is forever under me feet in the kitchen and the servants' hall. Him and his sheep's eyes. 'Tis hoping to be a footman here he is." "Is he?" asked Miranda, surprised. "But I thought he was a blacksmith." "And a good one, Mum." Peggy hesitated. "It's because of me he wants to come into service here. He knows I'll never leave you, so he's been thinking maybe—" "Of course," said Miranda, putting down her teacup. "I've been very stupid and selfish. Do you really love him, Peggy? Do you think he'll make you happy?" The girl nodded. Her bright Irish eyes softened. "He's willing to turn Catholic for me, Mum. And he's so good. He's never said a word about my leg." She turned and shook out Miranda's ruffled morning gown. "You shall have a wedding in June, dear," said Miranda quickly. "A beautiful one. We'll get a priest from Hudson, or New York if necessary. And your wedding dress, white, of course. White Indian muslin. I've a length put away in the attic somewhere." "Oh, Mrs. dear," cried Peggy, laughing. "White's only for gentry. 'Twouldn't be proper for the likes of me." "Of course it would. It's the happiest colour for brides." She paused, remembering a girl in green silk, the sound of rain beating on the windows. 4 years ago. 4 centuries. She jumped from the bed, thrusting her slender feet into the swansdown slippers which Peggy held for her. "I'll hurry and dress. We'll go up and find the muslin. I know just how it should be made. Bodice tight, skirt very full but no hoop, lace at the neck. I've a point de Venise collar in the lace box." Peggy twinkled affectionately. You couldn't make a white peacock out of a little mud hen with a twisted leg, she thought, but she held her peace. It was good to see the missus all bright and lively, that worried look gone from her. After breakfast, they went up to the attic together. This top floor covered the entire house, and the south wing was as familiar to Peggy as the back of her hand, for it housed the servants, and one of the tiny rooms was Peggy's. But they went through a green baize door into the seldom-entered storage section, which contained a maze of unfurnished cubicles and a raftered loft. They found the lace box without difficulty, but not the length of Indian muslin. Miranda had bought it during that first autumn of her marriage, intending to make it up later for the baby. It must have been stored with the other pathetic remnants of that brief and tragic period. Mrs. McNabb had attended to all that, and Miranda had never had the courage to investigate. She now found that there was amongst all the boxes and chests and trunks no trace of the tiny being upon whose coming had been lavished so much hope. Not even the cradle could they find anywhere. It must have been Nicholas's orders, thought Miranda with certainty. His hurt had been so deep that he had banished from his house every reminder of the baby, as he had banished them from his consciousness. Her eyes filled with tears. "Oh, why do I ever doubt him," she thought, "just because he is a man and hides his tenderness." Swept by a sudden warmth of pity for her husband, she sank down on a broken chair in a corner of the loft. It was then that she saw the mattress. Peggy was busy in one of the small storage rooms, repacking a trunk which they had ransacked, and Miranda sat alone amongst a welter of discarded furniture. A sunbeam struck through the cobwebs in the eastern dormer and shed its dusty light directly on an enormous rolled mattress, which stood up-ended against a painted casse. There was something familiar about the casse. She had seen those peeling roses and garlands before. She leaned forward, idly, and realized with a shock of distaste that it was the cupboard which used to stand in Johanna's room. All the furniture in this corner, she saw, had been Johanna's. There was the chipped table, with something sticky still adhering to its veneered surface, and this mattress had come from the Van Ryn bed. She rose abruptly and turned to go, when a peculiarity about the mattress stopped her. Years of mice and damp had mouldered the ticking, which had split in a dozen places. From one of these a dark object protruded. She touched it gingerly, and drawing it out, found that it was a leather-bound book. She opened it, and saw some pages of writing with the ink faded to brown. Puzzled, she riffled the pages, and on the last one, which contained writing, a sentence leaped at her. "And why does he bring me flowers, who never does? The pink oleander. I'm in mortal fear, but why should I be? Must be I'm feverish with my cold. Ever since that girl came. He's called a doctor for me, yet I'm not really ill. Not our own doctor, the new one." There was a space, and farther down, the last entry. "I've been so foolish. Nicholas was here and kind. He cut the tipsy cake and sprinkled nutmeg on it for me, the way he used to do when we were first married. He tells me the girl is going in a few days. I'm so glad. It will be all right now." There were more pages, but they were blank. The diary slipped from Miranda's fingers and fell to the floor. She stood motionless, staring down at it. After a moment she picked it up and put it in the pocket of the dimity apron with which she had protected her dress from the dust. She turned and walked out of the loft, unheeding Peggy's astonished call. She drew the diary from her pocket, and opening it, read the last page again, quickly. "See," she told herself, "there's nothing here. It means nothing. It's just that Johanna, too, sometimes found him so hard to understand. Then he was kind to her. She says so." Again she dragged her eyes from that sentence. "He says the girl is going in a few days." How had Nicholas known that she would be leaving Dragonwyck? There had been no such plan. It was because of Johanna's death. "No," she said out loud, "I must be calm. I must think clearly." Not half an hour ago in the attic she had resolved to avoid distortion and exaggeration. It was for some other reason of his own, of course, that Nicholas had decided she must leave Dragonwyck, perhaps simply to please Johanna. And this thought, which would have been unbearable then, now seemed to her inexpressibly comforting. She opened the book again and read the early passages. They were few and incoherent, but written in a neat, pretty writing that was so incongruous as having belonged to Johanna. As she read, Miranda's throat grew dry, for here was evidence of a dumb and despairing misery. "I think he hates me since that girl came. I know he never loved me as I did him, but we used to be happy. If I could only have a son. God help me, why does it have to be like this?" And another entry. "I finished the monograms on 2 of his handkerchiefs today and gave them to him. He said I'd better let Miranda finish the rest. The minx preened herself and smiled. Would to God she'd never come. She's always between us." Miranda raised her head. She remembered that speech of Nicholas. She remembered her own delight in it. And had she indeed preened herself, glorying in the petty triumph? She had been so contemptuous of those blotched monograms, so pleased with the exquisite ones she herself had embroidered to finish the set. How pitilessly she had thrust home every small advantage in the secret struggle which the 2 women had had. Once more she turned to the last page. "Why does he bring me flowers who never does?" There was nothing in these words, nothing on the page, and yet this time as she read them, it was as though cold black waters were seeping upward toward her heart. There was only one person who could reassure her, could help her get a true perspective, only one who knew the circumstances. She was seized suddenly with a feverish desire for action. She ran to the stables and told the astonished coachman that he must drive her to Hudson at once. She sent a groom flying to the house for a cape, and harried the stable boys until a horse was harnessed to the open landaulette. They made the trip to town in less than 2 hours, and all the way Miranda sat staring down at the road ahead, the diary clasped tight in her hand beneath the cape. Dr. Turner was in, but he was eating dinner, said old Rilla repressively, eyeing Miranda's informal attire with disfavor. They was mighty queer white trash that often came to the doctor's office, but this one was as wild-eyed and fly-away-looking as any of 'em. "Call him, please," said Miranda. "I must see him at once. Tell him it's Mrs. Van Ryn." That was different. Rilla grinned apologetically and bobbed her grizzled head, indicating a chair. Jeff came out of his little dining room, still chewing, the napkin in his hand. "My dear girl, I'm delighted to see you, but I hope there's nothing seriously wrong." "I don't know. I've got to see you alone." He nodded and ushered her into the surgery, closing the door behind them. She dropped her cloak on a chair, opened the diary at the last page, and held it out to him. "Nicholas is in New York. I found this today in the attic. It was hidden in a slit mattress, the old one that Johanna had. It's her diary. I want to know what you think of it." Jeff looked at her set face and down at the book in her hand. A chill went over him, a premonition. He read the diary's last page and sank slowly in the chair behind the desk. "My God," he said at last, very low. "The oleander." He read the entry again. "What do you mean?" said Miranda sharply. Jeff got up and went to his new bookcase. In it were over 100 books he had not owned 5 years ago. He turned to the herbal section in Lunt's toxicology. He turned his back on Miranda, carried the book to the window. Nerium oleander, family Apocynaceae. A glucoside somewhat similar in its action to digitalis, but possessed of great toxicity. The ingestion of 3 or 4 leaves has been known to kill cattle. Blossoms and bark equally poisonous. And at the bottom of the paragraph was the irrefutable list of symptoms. Sweat broke out on his forehead as he saw flung up at him in the small, clear type the exact clinical picture of Johanna's illness. Vomiting and colic, giddiness, slow and irregular heart action, marked mydriasis of the pupils, bloody flux, respiratory paralysis, death. Urine, usually normal in color and appearance, may be difficult to diagnose, easily confused with any other acute gastritis. He shut the toxicology and put it back in the bookcase. "What is it, Jeff?" whispered Miranda. "What were you reading?" She had not moved since she had handed him the diary. He sat down again behind the desk, instinctively trying for calm in this familiar position where he had solved so many problems. But there was no precedent for this. She leaned forward, pressing her hands on the desk. Her eyes, grown dark as the onyx brooch on her breast, regarded him steadily. "Tell me what you're thinking, Jeff." He had not been going to tell her. His first instinct had been to reassure her quickly and send her away, until he could find his own bearings and decide what to do. He changed his mind as he lifted his head and met her eyes. "I think," he spoke slowly, careful to exclude from his voice the slightest trace of emotion, "that in some way, by means of the oleander which he brought to her room, Nicholas murdered Johanna." She made a muffled sound. He ran to her side. She shook her head, pushing away his supporting arm. She walked from him and sat down on the small Windsor chair reserved for patients. He took a bottle of ammonia spirits from his cabinet, poured a stiff dose into a glass of water. "Drink this," he commanded. "I had to tell you, Miranda. If it were possible for me to spare you this horrible thing, I would. I have no proof, but I'm sure. And for your own safety, you must believe me." He began to pace the strip of drugget beside the desk. For her own safety. That was the core of fear which he had discovered simultaneously with his acceptance of the fact of murder. If Nicholas had once scaled the barrier which separated normal humanity from the outlaws, there was nothing to prevent his doing it again.
Jeff turned and knelt down beside her, taking her limp hand in his. "Miranda, you must never go back to Nicholas. I know this is a terrible shock, and to you must seem unbelievable. I wouldn't believe it either, except that I had a suspicion long ago at the time of the death. I was a fool, a criminal fool, not to have investigated more than I did, but I had nothing but a hunch to go on, and I couldn't find any trace of the common poisons, and I didn't know half as much as I thought I did." He began to speak quietly, in a casual voice, trying to reconstruct objectively.
"He must have planned it ahead for a long time. I believe he waited until Johanna developed some trivial illness, so that a doctor might be on hand. It was very clever." Jeff paused to master a wave of bitter humiliation. Nicholas had very neatly used him as a cat's paw. How shrewd to have chosen a young, inexperienced doctor, one, too, who was known to be a political enemy, so that there was even less chance of suspicion in the countryside. It was, he went on evenly, very like him to use flowers as an instrument of death. It would appeal to his fastidiousness. It happened, of course, when he was alone with her that night, and the tipsy cake, as I did suspect, must have been the agent. But how? He thought a minute. The silver nutmeg mill, of course. He ground the leaves. He thought of Nicholas's peculiar remark. Her foul gluttony has killed her. It had doubtless accorded with a man's sense of irony that Johanna's unhealthy passion for the cake had accomplished her death. All too vividly, Jeff now remembered the small green particles which had clung to the sticky slice he had examined. He had thought that they were angelica or citron. The sherry with which the cake was saturated would have disguised any flavor. She was befuddled with her cold, he said aloud. She wouldn't have noticed what he was doing with the mill. And at last Miranda stirred. "What difference does it make how it was done?" she said in a dull, flat voice. "It's only that you must believe the truth, to know," he answered gently. She raised her head and her lips parted in a blind and terrifying little smile. "I think I've always known," she said. Jeff made an involuntary sound. She shook her head. "No, not in the way you mean, not consciously, but in the dark, secret part of my soul where I never dared look." "Rubbish!" cried Jeff, made violent by relief. "This is morbid, Miranda. Let's try to be sensible and face together what must be done. We must keep our heads and use them." She was not listening. She lowered her eyes and stared at the gold band on her left hand. "I've been married 4 years to a murderer," she said in a dull, thin voice, "enjoying the results of that murder." "You couldn't help it. You didn't know," he said sharply. "If it hadn't been for me, it wouldn't have happened," she went on without listening to him. "It was the weakness in me touched off the evil in him, like flint and steel. Zélie knew, but I wouldn't listen." "Zélie?" repeated Jeff, bewildered. "You mean that old half-breed servant of the Van Ryns? But she was senile. Her wits were gone, and whatever she knew or didn't know has nothing to do with you." He put his hands on her shoulders. "Listen, my dearest girl, you must be brave and strong. You had nothing to do with Johanna's death. At worst you may have been the innocent cause, but you were innocent, and you must rid yourself of these morbid feelings of guilt. We can't change the past, but the future is clear. The murder must be exposed."